Welcome back to another episode of the Pursuit Zone Adventure Travel Podcast. I am your host, Paul Schmid, and I interview explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 157 with Luke Jordan. I ran into Luke at the Outdoor Adventure Expo in Minneapolis back in April, and he was giving a presentation about being the very first person to do a thru-hike of a relatively new long-distance hiking trail in the U.S. called the Great Plains Trail. Luke has a ton of knowledge to share about this trail. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email at paul@thepursuitzone.com or leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. And now, let me introduce my guest. The Great Plains Trail is a recently established long-distance hiking trail in the U.S. It stretches for 2,200 miles from the desert of West Texas to the Montana-Canadian border. It crosses 9 national park sites, 10 national forests and grasslands, 5 state high points, and 15 state parks. Luke Jordan spent 85 days on the trail in 2016, becoming the first person to thru-hike it. You can learn more about the trail at greatplainstrail.org and more about Luke at stridernct.com. Luke previously appeared in episode 30, talking about his thru-hike of the North Country Trail. Luke Jordan, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
So Luke, the Great Plains Trail, how did this come to be?
Basically, it was actually a Minnesota native, a guy by the name of Steve Myers. I think during his college years, it was back in the 90s, he was driving a lot between Colorado, where he was working, and his home in Minnesota. And so, back and forth on his trips, he started discovering these little spots kind of off the interstate and found out that there's all these little gems. And so he started to think, how cool would it be to have a trail that could potentially connect some of these spots together? And then he started thinking, is that even possible? So he started kind of poking around a little bit, asking some questions. And after a bit of research, during a couple years in the late, I guess it'd be the early, like the first decade of the 2000s, he found some like-minded people and took the first steps by forming the nonprofit group, which is now the Great Plains Trail Alliance. And they formed their board of directors and officially became an entity in 2012. And so that's kind of how the whole idea came to be.
Who is it that maintains this trail and funds this trail and so on?
We don't have a lot of trail that we built ourselves at this point. We're actually hoping to have a ribbon cutting later this year. We actually did get permission up in Nebraska to actually build some new trail this year. Otherwise, everything right now is pre-existing wherever possible. So there's already other volunteer groups and also like federal and state agencies within state parks and stuff like that already maintain the trail. But it'll kind of take the model of other existing trails, such as the North Country and the Appalachian Trail, where it'll be mainly a lot of the work on the ground will be done by volunteers. And so we're kind of in that phase now where we're starting to do a little bit of outreach and start finding those interested people who eventually start these projects in their local areas. And so right now, funding up to this point has been mainly donations from members and people that are interested in just helping out people that believe in this cause. Down the road, obviously, as we start getting permission to do some projects, we'll be going after some grant money, stuff like that for specific projects. But for now, it's really on a donation basis.
Is the trail only for hikers, or can people mountain bike on it or ride horses, or can they ride motorized vehicles?
So basically it's going to take the model of the closest one would be the Arizona Trail, which is a national scenic trail. They do allow non-motorized use. So they allow backpackers, mountain bikers, and horseback riders. But it will be a non-motorized trail, so there won't be any issues with ATVs or dirt bikes on it, stuff like that. So it'll be strictly for non-motorized use. But then there will be the advantage of having multiple user groups on it. So it'll definitely be open to those kind of things. But definitely, non-motorized all the way through.
Hey, I wanted to go back and ask you about this CDC route, because I remember you mentioning it in your presentation. First of all, can you explain briefly what is the CDC route and how did that kind of play into this part of your adventure?
So the CDC route was this concept envisioned by Ron Strickland. He's the founder of the Pacific Northwest Trail. He did a lot of research on that trail back in the 70s, 80s, trying to get it as National Scenic Trail, which eventually did happen. In 2009, they amended the National Trail System Act, and so it became official at that point. And so that kind of laid the groundwork. So while he was doing that, he thought of this idea, the concept of the C2C route is to link together existing trails and also fill in the gaps for a coast-to-coast adventure. So you can hike from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And basically how that plays in with the Great Plains Trail is my first through hike was over the North Country Trail 3 years prior. And that is the biggest significant chunk of the CDC route. It's like 60-ish% of it. And another big portion is the Pacific Northwest Trail. And then if you go eastward from there, the North Country goes almost all the way to the Appalachian Trail. So you would follow the Appalachian Trail north until you hit Baxter Peak. And then there actually is a trail that leads from there into Canada. That's called the International Appalachian Trail that you actually follow up into Quebec and you hit the Atlantic Ocean there. So the only gap right now is about 800 miles from Lake Sacagawea, where the North Country Trail ends, over to Glacier National Park in Montana, where the PNT starts. And how the Great Plains Trail fits into this is that it will most likely fill in some of that gap. The mileage is unknown at this point, but there's potential for about 300 miles of that gap to be filled. So it could drastically shrink that and make it more of a reality. And the reason why that applies to me is that when I was hiking the North Country Trail, I actually had the opportunity to meet Ron Strickland. He kind of introduced this idea to me. And so my goal eventually is to complete the entire CDC route, but basically instead of doing it as a through hike like Andrew Skirka did about 10 years ago, is to do it in pieces. So the North Country Trail was the first piece. And so the Great Plains Trail ended up being the second piece of that. And so I really only have two pieces left, and that's to hike basically from North Dakota and then to the Pacific Ocean using the PNT, and then plus the gap in between, and then to hike that northern part of the AT and go up all the way into Canada. So that's kind of how the Great Plains Trail fits into that bigger picture.
Man, that's one heck of a through hike, the C2C route. And I didn't even know there was the International Appalachian Trail. There's so many trails you just don't even know they're out there.
Yeah, and that's another problem is there's a lot. And so as soon as you hear about one, you want to do it, but then the time just flies by. It's hard to find the time to do all these amazing trails.
So the Great Plains Trail, it had been like 3 or 4 years, you said, since you did the North Country. What was it that made you want to go back and do this Great Plains Trail?
It started off the same reason why I did the North Country for my first through hike versus another more established one. I'm the person that I like to take the path that's less traveled. I like to have a unique experience. When I did the North Country, there had only been 3 people who had done it, so I ended up being the 4th through hiker. And I kind of liked it. I liked the solitude experience because it wasn't like the AT where there's hundreds or even thousands of people out there at once. I saw nobody except for on the weekends. And I kind of like it that way. I like it quiet. I like to really take in nature. So kind of that same philosophy. I wanted to find a trail that nobody's ever really done and to just go out there and get the full experience. And so that's kind of, I actually discovered it while I was doing the research for my North Country Trail hike because the board of directors had just formed. So they had a new presence on Facebook, and that's how I discovered it. I was scrolling through some pages and just kind of stumbled on it. So I bookmarked it for later. And when I got back from my North Country Trail through hike, it was in the back of my mind. So I kind of started going through the stuff again and got really captivated with what they were trying to do. And really started to see, I discovered all these little spots from their photographs of these things in the Great Plains that a lot of people don't know are even there because they really only go across, I-80 or I-70. Don't see any of these spots really up close. And at the time, because of I'd been introduced to the C2C route, my original thought was I was going to hike the Pacific Northwest Trail next. But then I got to thinking, that's only 1,200 miles. What I just did was 4,500 miles. And so could I make a hike longer? So I came up with the idea, maybe I can do both back to back. So my original plan was to actually hike the Great Plains Trail first in the way I did it. So starting in the south and then going north. But then as soon as I hit the border, my plan was to then hop back to Lake Sacagawea, where I started the North Country Trail, and then head west from there. So if you did both trails back to back, it'd be about 4,000 miles, which is still less than what the NCT was. That was kind of the original idea. The other side of that is I really found out about the Great Plains Trail Alliance, what they were trying to do, and I totally bought into the idea. And it's not just to create another long distance trail in a part of the country that doesn't really have one yet, but it's also to protect part of that resource, protect a big portion of what's left of the Great Plains and native prairie. So there's a conservation potential there, where even if everything else is gone, eventually, if this trail succeeds, they'll have this protected ribbon, maybe a half mile across that's still protected prairie, even if everything else is gone. So I kind of bought into that idea from that angle as well. And being a guy that has a natural resource background and who now works for another trail, I definitely saw that value as well. So I wanted to do what I could to kind of help them get the word out and help them, I guess, achieve their goal. And so I thought maybe the best way to do this is to give it a shot, try and hike it, and prove that it's possible and that people would actually be interested in doing it. So that's kind of what gave me the final push to give it a shot.
So when you did the NCT, I think you were just coming out of college, so you naturally had some time off. But for this go around, how did you manage to get that much chunk of time?
So at the time, I'd actually just taken, when I did this trail, I was working, I had an internship with actually the Student Conservation Association, which is just about to expire. And so my original plan was I was going to be unemployed in 2016. So I thought, what better time to do another adventure than when you don't have any work set up? And then I actually ended up, so I kind of committed to that and started planning. I had basically finished most of the potential planning for the Great Plains Trail at that point. So I started to move on and plan the Pacific Northwest Trail of my planned hike. And then I ended up getting an email from my now current boss, and that they had a job for me working on the North Country Trail basically full time, and said that if I wanted it, that I had to apply, but they would do what they could to get me in. So obviously I couldn't say no to that. And so I ended up applying. But the way that my position was set up was my salary comes from the National Park Service. And the way that it was set up was I was basically a full-time seasonal. I basically had a month off every year that was mandatory. So instead of taking the month off, I asked for 3 instead. And because it was during the off season, they let me take it essentially. And so I was able to take off the second half of February, all of March, all of April, and then the first week of May. And I was able to fit the hike into that 3-month time period.
So you're working for the North Country Trail. What do you do? What's your role?
My official title is outdoor recreation planner, but I wear about 4 or 5 hats in that position. A big portion of my job is actually running the volunteer program. So we have about 1,200 or so volunteers that are scattered through all 7 states that the NCT goes through. So I'm in Grand Rapids now because that's kind of the halfway point of the trail. We have our office in Lowell, Michigan. That includes, like, if anybody gets injured, I do the paperwork for that. I send all the supplies to the field. When they're building a new trail, I get the tools that they need. So I actually have a budget that I have to maintain with all the supplies. I also am in charge of the signage program. So if they build a new section of trail, I'm the one that approves and then supplies all the markers for it. And that includes the official emblem, which is kind of that pregnant triangle looking thing that all the National Scenic Trails have. And then part of that is also what we call certification, which is, it's basically just proof that the trail is allowed to be there by whoever owns the land that it goes through. And so it's really just a record keeping process for us, knowing that the trail we have on the ground is reasonably permanent, that it's going to be there for a while, and that it's not an immediate threat from any kind of impacts, whether that be from infrastructure or anything otherwise. And so that's a big part of my job as well, is just keeping an eye and obviously getting new sections of trail registered underneath that program. And I do a little bit of other things here and there. I do a little bit of mapping stuff, a little bit of responding to infrastructure as they come up, such as a pipeline or a cell tower or something like that would impact the trail. A little bit of everything. It's mostly a desk job. I'm at my computer most of the time. I get out in the field once in a while. But yeah, it's definitely it's a good place to start, especially if you have, like me, I have a unique knowledge of the trail. So it really helps whenever an issue comes up. I'm able to identify exactly where it's going on. I know who to contact already because I met most of them during my through hike. Having hiked the trail definitely came in handy in my current job.
I think you mentioned it took you about 1.5 years, correct me if I'm wrong, to plan for the Great Plains Trail.
Yeah.
And so what were you doing for that 1.5 years?
So basically, I was still working, obviously, kind of like what happened with the NCT. I was in college at the time. Any free time that I had, I spent planning it. And because there had been no through hikers, because the trail was pretty new, I basically just started going through. I identified all the places that they were trying to connect to, and I just put a dot on the map. And then I mapped any existing trails they were planning on using, and then mapped those first, and then focused on filling in the gaps in the best way possible. And to do that, I actually ended up making a map completely from scratch on Google. So I ended up, at the end of the planning session after a year, I had a 2,200 mile long KML file that I downloaded onto my phone actually out on the trail. And I had a paper version as a backup that I actually superimposed onto a topo map and hiked with that. So if anything happened to my cell phone, I still have something in the field to actually use. And so kind of later on, as I got closer to, as I kind of nailed down all the parts that already exist, and I got closer to the actual date where I'd be departing, about probably about 3 months before I took off, I actually had a weekly conference call with Steve, the founder, and we went through all the portions of the trail together via conference call once a week, and we ended up mapping more of the kind of the uncertain portions where we weren't quite sure where it was going to go, and ended up coming up with the best route just between the two of us talking. And so I would put that on the map, and that ended up being my route for the trail. And it's even changed a little bit since I did it, because we found better places while we were out there. But that's kind of how the whole thing came to be. Is I spent a year just essentially mapping the whole thing, and I would figure out the details about the certain region I was going through while I was doing that. So I would find out what the terrain was like in Colorado, figure out what the challenges were, and so that really helped when I had to plan things such as my water drops and like the vehicle support as well.
What are you taking out there with you? Let's talk about your gear for a bit.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit about what you got for a backpack and what you have in it and how much you're carrying with you.
Sure. So my pack is actually a Granite Gear, Minnesota-based company where I'm from. 70 liters, so much smaller than my original one that I brought on the NTT, which is a Go Light. It's a little bit heavier than most hikers would probably like, but I like it because it's durable. And out there when you're being exposed to the elements for that long, it's definitely handy. My base weight was about, I want to say 14-ish pounds, but I was weighed down a lot by the extra stuff, food and water. I had to carry a lot of water on this trip because it starts in the desert, obviously. And you're in semi-arid environments for most of it, if not really the whole thing. So water is definitely a big concern. And that's part of the way I had to actually get some water drops kind of planned out. And I had a bunch of those in Colorado. And I would have needed them in New Mexico as well if I didn't have any vehicle support. But I ended up having vehicle support through most of that state because it's a challenge to hike it right now because there's not a whole lot of off-road trail there. So water ended up being actually a big part of my gear that I wasn't anticipating until I got closer and closer to the date, and figured out just how much I would have to carry with me. And it ended up being about 7 liters, which is pretty heavy. And so I never really even weighed my pack because I knew that it would kind of psych me out if I knew how heavy it was. But definitely more than I should have been carrying. But given the situation, I was just kind of uncomfortable in carrying any less than that, even with the water drops I had planned. So just kind of the basic pack setup, I had my solo tent from REI, my old sleeping bag that I got when I turned 21, which is the Lafuma, I think is how you pronounce it. It's just the same one I used on the NTT. It's still going pretty strong. I carried a water bladder with me, and then plus a bunch of extra bottles on the inside. Did not have a GPS, but a lot of smartphones now have a GPS function on it, obviously. So I had that, and that's actually how I navigated the maps as well. As I just turn on my phone and open up the KML file that I had, and obviously I had to carry the maps for all the existing sections. An example being like the Black Hills. Nat Geo has a map for the entire forest there, so I was able to hike that portion with a good waterproof topo map. All the National Forests and Grasslands had their own maps. All the national parks had their own maps. So for the existing trail sections, that was a key piece of gear as well, is to have the trail already overlaid onto the topography, and shows you where all the trailheads are and any campsites, stuff like that. Everything else was just, winter clothes, because when you're out there on the Great Plains, you can have all 4 seasons in the span of a couple of days, which I did encounter that many times, particularly in North Dakota, whereas literally over the span of 4 days, one day was a different season. It was pretty crazy. So warm gear was critical, but on the other side of that, it can also get really hot out there, which again is where the water comes into play. And so I definitely had a change of clothes that made it pretty easy to transition. I did have a InReach device as well, which is it's another version of the Spot device that a lot of people are familiar with. But it was made by DeLorme, but Garmin recently acquired it. But I have one of the original models, so it's kind of an older one that actually doesn't have its own screen on it. But that's basically, it's a safety measure. Me that I hike solo, I have that in case I ever run into trouble. There's a little panic button on it that if you get into a really dicey situation, you can call for help. And it also has the 3 pre-programmed commands. So I can send a message home that just says, hey, I made it into camp for the day. Everything's cool. This is my last known location if anything happens, kind of thing. So definitely a safety device for anybody hiking solo. That was definitely an essential that I bring on all my long hikes. That's one thing I won't go without. First aid kit, I never had to use, thankfully. Kind of the basics for the most part. Nothing too extravagant, nothing too much of a luxury. I kind of tried to stick to bare bones basics as much as possible.
How much help did you get from other people with these water caches and water reuse supplies and so on?
I got quite a bit of help. The biggest instance actually was most of the state of New Mexico. Early on when I was planning this hike, I realized that New Mexico would be a big problem hiking it solo. And my way around that was actually to get some help from the board of directors. What ended up happening was they each took about a week of vacation time, and they came down when I first started and got me through a lot of the big roadwalk stretches. New Mexico is unique in the sense that there's a lot of public land, but it's all in the western side of the state, so it's away from where the Great Plains Trail goes. So on the eastern side of the state, there isn't a whole lot available, at least not right now, as far as camping is concerned. There's a couple state parks here and there. There's a national grassland right in the middle, but nothing really on the south or north of there. So hiking it, or I guess camping legally, is an issue right now. So my way around that is that they each committed to 5 days, and they would come down, and I would hike as far as I could in a day, and then so I would stop in the middle of a road. They would come pick me up, bring me to the nearest campground, and then we would drive back to the same spot in the morning. And then I'd start from there. And so I was able to get through New Mexico pretty quick doing that. But anybody that's hiking it without vehicle support is going to have an issue at this time. It's really hard just in New Mexico if you're on foot to navigate it without support right now. That was kind of the biggest assistance that I had, was right off the bat, trying to get through New Mexico in a safe and obviously appropriate way without breaking the rules, because stealth camping is always frowned upon. Especially out there, it'd be all private land and you're totally exposed. You're in ranch country out there, so there's nowhere to really do that anyway. So that's really the one of the most challenging things right now, is getting through New Mexico in a way that's allowed. And so that was the biggest help that I had. But I did have a couple people along the way. They would bring me into town occasionally if I needed resupply, or I stayed in a couple of people's homes along the way, like you would on any trail. But I was surprised at how much support I got hiking a route that at this time didn't really exist yet, and especially that part of the country isn't really used to seeing backpackers come across. And so it was really nice to see the excitement in a lot of people's eyes when I told them what I was doing. And I was also happy to see that of all the people I talked to, there was never really a lot of hostility towards the trail. All the people out there were pretty open to it. And I think it being multiple use was a big selling point out there. There's lots of, ranchers, a lot of equestrian users, a lot of mountain bikers as well, probably a little bit further west. But I think having it open to all three uses, if it had been just a backpacking trail, I think there would have been a lot more resistance. But the fact that it's all inclusive, I think is kind of a big selling point. So I was really happy to see that of all the people I met, there was nobody that was just like openly opposed to the idea of the trail. So that was really cool to see. By the end of the hike, I ended up meeting, I think, close to 50 people that ended up becoming trail angels. And so if you do the math, that's more than one a day on average, which is pretty impressive, really, for a trail that doesn't really exist yet. So that kind of blew me away.
What about food? Let's just say all the water was not an issue. Are you going to be able to easily take enough food with you until you reach the next resupply town?
Yeah. So some of the stretches are a stretch, literally. I would compare it to the North Country Trail as far as availability of resupply goes. I hiked about 25 miles a day, just like I did on the NCT. And many of the times it was, 5 to 7 days between towns. So it definitely is possible, but you need to be willing to really like it if you're on foot, to really be able to hike high miles and be able to carry that much food. But it's definitely possible. And I still stick to the post office method, where I had all the towns kind of pre-chosen where I get resupplied, and then just have all the food prepared ahead of time. And then I left a calendar back home with my family, and they would keep track of my progress. And so they'd have on the calendar my original itinerary when I was supposed to arrive in each town, and they would just kind of keep track of that, and they would send the stuff to go to that town ahead of my arrival. And then so when I got there, I just went to the post office and showed them my ID, and there was a box with my name on it, dump it into my pack and go. I think that's also, the best way on trails that are less popular than the Triple Crown is, because a lot of the people, they're not used to hikers coming through. And a lot of these little towns, you can't guarantee that the convenience store will have what you need. So the best way, I think, to assure is just get it all ahead of time and send it to yourself. I think that's really the safest way to just stay resupplied out there.
In your presentation, you mentioned something, I think you mentioned it, I wrote it down in my notes, called the Grand Canyon Syndrome. What is that?
That's actually a nickname that I learned from somebody else. It's also known as water intoxication and something else. It's basically when you drink too much water And the result of that is it pushes all the other necessary stuff like salt and electrolytes out of your body too quickly. And as it turns out, your body can't really function on just water. You need all the other stuff too. And so it's sometimes called Grand Canyon syndrome because that's a common place where it happens. People, they're in the desert, they're not used to that kind of environment, so they kind of overcompensate and they drink too much water and they end up getting sick, and some of them end up dying because they actually ended up essentially drowning themselves. They end up getting dehydrated because they drink too much water, and it pushes all the other stuff you need, like the salt, out of your body too quickly, and they can't replenish it fast enough. So they end up just kind of not having the energy, and they get trapped and sometimes die from it. I had a very brief encounter with that. It would have been my third night on the trail where I made the same mistake. I didn't pack enough like salty food. I didn't pack enough electrolyte powder. So I was drinking a lot of water coming from Minnesota in a place where we had water every square mile. And there was snow on the ground when I left. I was used to it being, wet all the time. And I never hiked in the desert before. And so I definitely felt nervous going into it. And I think it might have been unseasonably hot when I got to Guadalupe Mountain National Park, which is in the Chihuahuan Desert. It was 90 degrees. And the first week of my hike was in 90-degree, 85-degree heat and not a whole lot of water. And so I ended up kind of making the same mistake. I overcompensated a little bit. The third day was it was a heck of a climb going up the Wilderness Ridge to kind of cross over into New Mexico. I had this moment where I essentially lost my muscle control in my legs. And it was telling me, my gut was telling me, you should turn around now, otherwise you might get stranded on the other side. And so I kind of just decided to turn around. I went back to the ranger station, took a little rest in the shade, and ended up getting a ride back to the campground. I got resupplied, so I bought tons of Gatorade. I bought some fresh fruit, some salty food, and kind of ate some overnight, and then again in the morning. And then I actually got dropped off on the other side of the ridge where I would have come out. I would have spent that night essentially. I got dropped off at that same spot, and then continued on. It was definitely scary, especially in a situation that I wasn't accustomed to and had never experienced before. It was a little bit nerve-wracking. That's kind of where the name comes from, because the Grand Canyon is a common place where it occurs.
Hey, let's get into the states that you go through, and we can talk about each one, and you can hit whatever you think you want to talk about for each one, the highlights or whatever. So the first one is Texas. What do we need to know about Texas?
So Texas has the distinction right now of having 100% of the trail is done. It's complete. And that being in Guadalupe Mountains National Park, it's all established trail. And it's not a lot. It's like maybe 40 miles total. But it ended up being, despite the not being used to the desert, it was one of the highlights, I think, as far as scenery-wise. It's definitely worthy of being a national park. And also happens to be the highest point of the whole trail, starting on top of Guadalupe Peak, one of the 5 high points that the trail connects to. And so for me, it was basically 3.5 full days of hiking to get through the park. So definitely a scenic highlight for sure. So now in the future, it'll just be a matter of talking to the park and getting permission to put up some markers of some kind to designate the route through there as part of the Great Plains Trail. That's something that we have on our agenda for down the road at some point.
Next one's New Mexico. You already mentioned hard to get through without vehicle support, but what else should we know about New Mexico?
So New Mexico is kind of transitions from the desert into more grassland areas, kind of on the northern end. There's only about 10 miles of total trail in New Mexico. That's mostly in the Lincoln National Forest, which is just north of Texas. There's a few small pieces here and there on like state parks. Otherwise, it's almost 500 miles of road walking right now. That's what makes it difficult right now to navigate, I guess, accurately. If you want to do it properly, it's impossible to do it right now without vehicle support, but definitely still worth seeing. There's lots of cool spots, even on the road walks. I was able to go right through Roswell, obviously famous for the the UFO alien contact history. Little gems like Santa Rosa, which is kind of it's actually kind of a B&B town. There's a nice little lake, kind of a little oasis in the middle of the desert there. I-40 goes through there. I ended up taking my first zero. That would have been after the first 3 weeks or so. Took my first zero in Santa Rosa, nice little community. North of there is the Kiowa National Grassland, where we don't have any off-road trail yet, but there's a cool area known as Mills Canyon that I ended up camping there a couple nights with the vehicle support, and we hope to eventually bring the trail through there. It's pretty spectacular scenery. And then north of there, there's actually Capitolin Volcano National Monument, which there actually is a trail on the rim. It's an extinct volcano, and so there's a trail on the rim you can follow. And then just north of that, there's actually a portion of the Santa Fe Trail that you can still find wagon ruts. And the Forest Service has kind of put up these I think they're limestone or sandstone markers that kind of marks the original route, and you can clearly see kind of the trench that was cut out from the wagons going back and forth. That's definitely kind of a cool spot. So lots of despite not having a lot of off-road trail right now, New Mexico has quite a bit of history, probably more than most states, with the exception being maybe Nebraska. So definitely worth hiking nonetheless, for sure.
The roads that you're hiking, are they paved or gravel or both?
Some of them are paved, mostly gravel. There was one road in particular. I was on the same road for 3 days. It was about 60 miles long through ranch country. They meander quite a bit too. They kind of follow the terrain. And that particular road, it was the closest one to the Pecos River. It was kind of paralleling that. We try to avoid the pavement wherever possible. Sometimes you can't. One of those examples is also in New Mexico. There was literally only one road. It was the one going basically to Roswell. It was a 4-lane highway. And that was really the only, luckily it was only a day that I had to walk it. For the time being, we're kind of restricted in certain areas. It's actually pretty remote out there, even on a car sometimes. Like you can go miles and hours without seeing another road crossing. It's pretty amazing.
What kind of vehicle traffic you see on the dirt roads?
Hardly any. There were many days where we wouldn't see a single vehicle. There are others where there'd be maybe 10, and it's people that live on the road. I remember one of the experiences I had early on was, I think, like the 5th or 6th day. It was just north of Roswell. I was on that long gravel road, and I met a rancher and his wife came out. So they passed me on the road in their pickup truck, and obviously they were kind of perplexed at what a backpacker was doing out there. And so they just stopped and talked to me for a little bit. They seemed a little bit reserved at first and kind of suspicious, if nothing else. And I told them what I was doing, and I carried these little business cards with me. They kind of had the stats on it. I had a map of the trail. So I handed them one of these business cards. So they kind of saw that what I was doing was true and legit. Then afterwards, like, oh, well, it's too bad we didn't see you sooner. We would have invited you in for breakfast. And so that's kind of where the trail magic started happening too. So it was kind of funny, but so really minimal traffic on the back road. So we try and route it on there whenever possible to kind of keep it off the pavement.
Next is Oklahoma.
Oklahoma is really, really brief because we just barely touch the panhandle. So for me, it ended up being basically 2 full days was in Oklahoma. And then I was clear up into Colorado already. But basically, the reason why it goes to Oklahoma is it gets the high point there, which is right on the border of New Mexico. It's Black Mesa. So one of the 5 high points. And there's a nice little bed and breakfast there that I stayed in. It's right at the base of the mesa. There's also a state park a little bit south of there that might be on the route at some point. And one of my resupplies was just down the road. There's a little town of Kenton, Oklahoma. I got resupplied there. Spent the night in the B&B, and then hiked to the summit that day, and then made my way north into Colorado and transitioned into the Comanche National Grassland from there.
Yeah, tell me some more about Colorado, because I have in my notes here too that you got caught in some kind of blizzard. Yeah,
so Colorado's where I had my first kind of really bad weather. This would have been early to mid-March. I was in Colorado. So New Mexico has the most mileage of all the states, but Colorado is pretty close behind. So New Mexico has about 500 miles. Colorado is just shy of that. So a lot of miles of trail in Colorado. So I hit a pretty severe winter storm in Denver. I actually got stranded for a day. But before that, I had, I think, a total of 3 or 4 actual snowfalls in Colorado. And one of the nights ended up being my coldest on the whole trail. It got down to almost 0 degrees one night. And I woke up trying to break down my tent. There's actually frost on the inside of my tent. It was pretty crazy. There's ice forming there. And then, so breaking down my camp that morning was kind of uncomfortable. I could definitely feel after, it only took me 15 minutes to get going, but I'd already had like frostbite starting to form. And luckily there was a gas station just down the street. So I went inside and got warmed up a little bit. Colorado is, it's kind of unique too. There's all kinds of different environments because obviously it stays east of the Rockies. Denver is about as far west as it gets. That's kind of the westernmost point. Then it meanders east again. But you kind of, coming from Oklahoma, you kind of start out, you're in the Comanche National Grassland. There's a pretty nice stretch of trail through there. It's called Picket Wire Canyon. It's 8 miles one way right now, but we hope to eventually punch a way through so it's no longer a dead end. But there's some ruins down there. There's some fossilized dinosaur tracks along the Purgatory River. It's pretty cool. That'll bring you up into the La Junta area, and there will be a possible connection to Bensol Fort National Historic Site at some point, depending on how the routing goes. A little bit north of there, the scenery changes again. You're in what they call the Black Forest area, which is kind of southeast of Denver a little ways. It's kind of part of the foothills, but it sticks way east, further east than any other part of the Front Range really does. You get little communities like Albert there, Peyton's kind of in that area, and then Castlewood Canyon State Park, which is just south of Denver. I ended up wandering through there. that connects to the Cherry Creek Trail and then the South Platte River Trail, which actually brings you through Denver. And the reason I went that way, that actually wasn't supposed to be on the route. It was supposed to stick further east through little communities like Kiowa, I think. But I ended up going that way because there's actually off-road trail. So I was able to get through the Denver area without getting on a road, which is pretty amazing. And so those two trails back to back create about 45 miles of trail, even though it's paved most of the way. Actually created a pretty nice route. A lot of it's just the green space through Denver. So a lot of the time you really can't even tell that you're in a big city until you're on the stretches that you're literally right up at the base of the tall buildings. Otherwise, for a ways, you really can't even tell that you're in this big metropolis. So after leaving Denver, which is where I got caught in the major blizzard, I actually got stranded for about half a day, which is kind of interesting. After that, it kind of follows the South Platte River northeast a little bit and goes through like Jackson Lake State Park, which is about the halfway point of the trail right now, roughly. And then you go up into the Pawnee National Grassland where there's the Pawnee Buttes Trail that's going to be part of the Great Plains Trail as well. And so definitely eastern Colorado, often overlooked because the Rocky Mountains are right there, but there definitely is some cool stuff to see as well.
Next up is Nebraska. What can you tell us about Nebraska?
Nebraska, I can tell you lots about Nebraska. Nebraska ended up being my favorite state, actually, of all the states. And part of that was from just being so surprised of what I actually discovered there. Another part of it was just the amount of trail magic that I got. I met somebody in Nebraska every single day that was super excited about the trail and like wanted to help out, wanted to get involved. They were definitely the most enthusiastic people that I met. And some of the best trail magic happened there too. For example, the day that I reached the state line, there was a big storm coming in that night. And I didn't know much about it until about halfway through the day. And as people started passing me in their cars, they would stop and tell me like, hey, there's a storm coming, right? I ended up meeting a woman right at the state line that she basically convinced me to let her give me a ride into Kimball, which is the nearest town, because the storm was picking up steam and it was getting a lot worse. And I'm so glad that I accepted her offer because that night it actually hit a lot sooner than they were planning. So about 9 o'clock in the evening, one of the 3 times in my life I've ever seen rain, snow, and lightning at the same time. Definitely not a place to be out on the Great Plains and that kind of stuff. But little things like that. Some cool spots of trailheads is right there at the state line is Panorama Point, which is the high point of Nebraska. And then you got the city of Kimball, which is kind of I guess that would be the closest thing to a trail town in that area. North of there, I was really impressed with the Wildcat Hills and the Scottsbluff area. I'd seen some photographs of it, but never really understood the true beauty that's there until I actually saw it firsthand. It's pretty amazing. It kind of reminds me of the Black Hills, but it's still unique and different enough. And obviously Scottsbluff is famous for any history buffs. That's a major spot on the Oregon Trail coming through there. So it was definitely nice to finally experience that part of the Great Plains for myself. And I ended up just falling in love with Nebraska. The nicest people there, and some pretty high mileage of off-road trail too. North of there, I ended up going through Agate Fossil Beds, which is a national monument. It probably will not end up going there long term though. The reason is it's a pretty sensitive archaeological site. And so the chances of them allowing us to build a trail anywhere near there is pretty slim. So most likely it'll stay a little bit further east. It'll go from Scottsbluff. It'll probably head up towards like Minotaur Lake area, which is it's co-owned by the state and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then kind of up into the Alliance area, which people know that's where Carhenge is. It's kind of this famous landmark. And then to Boxby, which is a state reservoir. And then from there, it'd be pretty easy to tie into an existing trail system through the Pine Ridge, which is in the Nebraska National Forest. And that's kind of the route that I'm hoping they'll end up taking at some point. The Pine Ridge, too, kind of blew me away. It definitely reminded me of the Black Hills. A lot of people don't know there's actually a forest in Nebraska, and that's where it is. And people that think the state is flat, like you really have to get off the interstate and really go north a little bit, and you'll start seeing all kinds of cool stuff. So I was really blown away and surprised by the scenery in Nebraska and the people too. Fort Robinson is one of the cool areas, and also the Ogallala National Grassland where there's some existing trail, and we got permission to build some new trail there this coming year. So we'll be having a ribbon cutting event probably in late September up there, pending the completed construction of that segment. And I actually found out while I was in this area that I was actually at Fort Robinson, which is just west of Chadron, where the Forest Service office is. I found out that I actually have a family tie to this area. I have a relative that used to work for the Forest Service, and some of her old friends were still in the area. One of them tracked me down and ended up taking me out to dinner, and he kind of told me some of the history of the area and some of the projects that he and they were on together. And I found out that my aunt was actually on several projects up in the Ogallala Grasslands that now the trail kind of connects to them, which is kind of funny. And I found out afterwards that as a baby, she was still stationed out there in the Forest Service. And so I actually spent my first Christmas there, which is kind of funny. So I kind of had this weird family history to this area that I never knew about until I did this. So that was it kind of added another element of cool to the journey.
Yeah, that's always neat when you find out those little pieces of history about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Next is South Dakota.
Yeah, so South Dakota is actually the state I was looking forward to the most when I first started planning this thing. It was the only state I was familiar with at all. I'd only been to the Black Hills once, and it had been about 5 years prior. So I was really excited to get back and see a lot more of it. So obviously, Black Hills is the big highlight. Within that, you have several other spots of interest. South Dakota also has the distinction of having the most miles of completed trail. It's almost 200, which is about half of the completed mileage that there is total right now. We use portions of both the Mickelson and the Centennial trails. And South Dakota is also unique in the sense that the trail will have to split here for our multiple trail users. And the reason being the Centennial Trail goes through the Black Elk Wilderness. And there are some areas of the Centennial Trail that do not allow horses or mountain bikes. So for that reason, anybody traveling by those two user groups will have to continue on the Mickelson Trail all the way to where it ends in Deadwood and then over to Sturgis. And anybody walking on foot would have that option to also go that way, or they will branch off, go towards Hot Springs, and then head up to Wind Cave National Park where the Centennial Trail starts. And then that trail is hiking only most of the way until you get to the northern 40 miles or so. And then that'll bring you through the Black Elk Wilderness, past Mount Rushmore, over Harney Peak, which is South Dakota's high point. And then the Centennial Trail actually ends at the summit of Bear Butte, which is a state park just north of Sturgis. So the two routes will end up meeting again in Sturgis, depending on what mode of transportation you're going by. So there'll be kind of a unique spot there in South Dakota where there'll actually be two routes you can take, depending on your preference, really. And then once you get north of the Black Hills, there's 2 units of the Custer National Forest, where there's kind of like a miniature version of the Black Hills. There's the Cave Hills area and the Slim Buttes area, both of which have existing campgrounds. So definitely the scenery doesn't end just at the Black Hills. There's definitely more than just that out there. So I think overall, South Dakota definitely had the best scenery in several spots kind of clustered together, and it has the most miles of completed trail. So I guess from an experience standpoint, South Dakota is probably the highlight of the whole trail. And as far as the surprise factor, Nebraska was definitely the best. So actually, that's kind of the one thing we're doing now. I'm now on the board of directors for the trail, and we're kind of promoting that portion of the trail, basically the Nebraska and South Dakota portions, is kind of where we're focusing most of our efforts in both promotion and trail development. And that's for those multiple reasons, for sure. Some of the best scenery, the most miles of completed trail, and the most potential interest from either existing trail groups or just the communities in those areas, for sure.
Next is North Dakota.
North Dakota for me was kind of a high point, both because for me it was the last state I had to traverse, and also because I had lived there briefly. I spent about a year living in Fargo immediately following my NCT thru-hike. That's actually where I started my internship, was out there. And so that's kind of where I was first introduced to the Great Plains, because Fargo's kind of on the eastern end of it. A portion of the NCT actually goes through the Cheyenne National Grasslands. There are a good 35, 40 miles of it. So I kind of got a little bit of a taste for it and really wanted to see more, because it definitely, seeing the big skies, it's a whole different beast out there compared to living in the North Woods where I'm originally from. And I kind of wanted to see, I learned a new appreciation for it from living out there and really wanted to see more. And so I kind of felt like I was going home in a way when I finally reached North Dakota. It goes through, I guess Bowman is going to be a trail town at some point. And then from there, White Butte, which is the high point of North Dakota, there's a little trail that kind of goes to the top. And then you're on the Mattahey Trail at that point, which goes through the Little Missouri National Grasslands, connects both units of Roosevelt National Park together. And that's a trail that's pretty famous with mountain bikers in particular. Doesn't get a whole lot of backpackers that I'm aware of. Definitely some out there. And so, but that's about 120 miles of existing trail right there as well. So North Dakota also has a pretty big chunk. The north unit of Roosevelt National Park, from there, it'll probably meander more towards like Wofford City area, and then end up utilizing the short trail, which is the Cartwright Tunnel Trail, and the Fairview Bridge, which is an old rail grade that crosses the Yellowstone River right before it dumps into the Missouri. That's North Dakota for the most part, and the trail is It was originally planned to go through Montana as well. Right now it doesn't, and there's a couple reasons for that. The big one is there's possible long-term routing issues. That part of Montana, it's pretty open, not a whole lot of towns. If you're going by foot, it's going to be a really, really long stretch. On top of that, we have to find a way to get around the Fort Peck Reservation, which is a pretty big area, and find a way to get to the Canadian border and back with enough resupply points, which is pretty challenging. So we'll have to do some kind of long-term feasibility study of that down the road. If we ended up going with it, one place we hope to connect to would be the American Prairie Reserve, and we'd follow along the Missouri River for a little ways and then kind of head north from there towards like Malta. Because of that, right now the northern terminus is kind of in question where it's going to be long-term. So for now, it's in North Dakota. The original idea was to have it end at Grasslands National Park, which is actually a Canadian national park, so it'd be just over the border. It'd be kind of an overlook looking into the park from the U.S. That was kind of the original idea. Right now, it ends in a little ghost town called Northgate, which is north of Lewis and Clark State Park, which is right on Lake Sacagawea. It's a ghost town just west of Des Lacs National Wildlife Refuge. That's where the terminus currently is. And another potential option would be the International Peace Garden further east in the Turtle Mountains of North Dakota. That's a National Park Service affiliated area. And there's lots of scenery to take in there too. So those are kind of the three possibilities right now. But for the time being, it makes sense to end it in North Dakota. There's enough services. There's a town about a day's walk from each other, so it makes it easy. They all have motels or campgrounds, so that makes that part of it easy. Resupply is easy, and there's also a couple cool little state parks to take in as well. So that was kind of where my journey ended, was at the Canadian border there. Got in the car and made a little quick stop at Lake Sacagawea State Park, where I'd been 3 years prior on my North Country trail hike, and then went home for 5 days and started preparing for the trip to Michigan. It was a pretty hectic 5-day period there.
Hey, I wanted to go back and ask you about the Mattahey Trail, because I have here in my notes something about hypothermia. Did you get yourself into a little bit of trouble on that trail?
Yes, I did. So the Mattahey Trail was one of the parts where I experienced all 4 seasons in the span of 4 days. So that trail is about 120 miles long. So I was on it for about 5 days. And it would have been the third day. The night before, I'd experienced... The trail was wet from raining off and on the 3 days prior to that, and the soil up there, it's like this mud, clay, gumbo stuff, and when it gets wet, it's slippery like ice, and so I was falling over a lot, almost fell off a cliff at one point. I mean, not really a cliff, it's more like a clay like hill, but it was a good 30 feet off the ground. That night, I ended up setting up tent, and right as I was going to bed, it started to rain, and then the rain turned to snow, and so I'm just soaking wet, and I knew that I would get up the next morning, the next day was going to suck. And sure enough, I wake up and there's a couple inches of snow already on the ground. And so I just packed up my gear as quickly as possible. And I had everything that I had with me, I had on. And as the day went on, it kept switching between rain and snow, just off and on. And eventually the moisture penetrated all my layers until it hit my skin. And at that point, I was like, well, if I stop moving, I'm going to start shivering. And so at that point, I just had to keep walking and hope that something worked out. Ended up meeting an oil worker. This is kind of right on the edge of the Bakken oil patch up there. So there was a guy out there kind of checking the rigs before he headed out to Iowa. And he ended up giving me a ride into the nearest town. He's the only vehicle I saw all day. He's the last vehicle I saw that day. So if he wouldn't have been there, I don't know what would have happened. It was the only time on the trail I definitely felt scared. And it was because I had early stages of hypothermia, just from being wet and cold for too long, with really no way to get out of it. There's no buildings nearby, no shelter of any kind, just nothing out there. So he ended up dropping me off at a little town called Beach, right on the border of North Dakota, Montana. So it was a good 20, 30 miles from where I was on the trail. So getting back the next day was kind of a pain in the butt. Ended up having some trail magic that worked out pretty well the next morning, though. But basically, he dropped me off at a truck stop, and I felt no shame in just stripping down to nothing and just put all my stuff in the washing machine, and then the dryer, just kind of sitting there in the lobby shivering, waiting for it to be done. And then I just put it on immediately when it came out. It was like that warm, the fresh laundry smell, the warm fabric. It felt so good. But yeah, the only time on any trail that I've ever felt truly scared was because of early stages of hypothermia. That was kind of an eye opener.
Did you run into any rattlesnakes on the trail, and how were you kind of protecting yourself from rattlesnakes?
I did not, luckily. I don't like snakes to begin with, and I have yet to see one in the wild that could kill me like that. How I prepare for them, though, is I actually did wear a pair of snake guards, which are basically they're giant shin guards that are a hard material that they can't bite through. They actually also protect you from like thorn bushes and cacti too, which actually came in handy. But I ended up not seeing one. I think mostly because it was still too early in the year for a lot of them. There are some days, obviously, where especially early on, like down in the desert, I could have easily seen one, like down in Texas and New Mexico. But I think as I got further and further north, it was still too early in the year. So I ended up, other than a few days here and there where it was warm enough they may have popped out, I ended up not seeing any, which I wasn't complaining for sure. But anybody that hikes it in the fall definitely would have a greater opportunity of seeing them. I think if you do it in the spring, you have less of a chance of seeing them. And that's actually how this trail is intended to be hiked. It's definitely not possible during the summertime. You're just too exposed. It's too hot. It's intended to be, you hike it northbound in the spring like I did, or you go southbound in the fall. Those are kind of the two ways to hike it. So you're looking at February to May or August to November is kind of your two windows of time there. So yeah, no rattlesnakes, luckily, but tons of other wildlife. Saw lots of pronghorn antelope when I was out there. Saw some elk in the Black Hills, lots of bison, wild horses up in Roosevelt National Park, if you can believe that. Lots of the typical stuff, lots of deer, big birds, a couple porcupines even here and there. Further north, like in North Dakota, I saw a couple of those. Saw a mountain goat in South Dakota. That was pretty cool. It was up by Harney Peak. Nothing really of note besides those things, but yeah, definitely some cool megafauna out there.
What does somebody need for a budget to do a through hike?
I budgeted about $5,000. That would have allowed for plenty of motel stays, which on this trail, unfortunately, you're kind of restricted to that. In some of these little towns, there really is no campground or anywhere to camp. So sometimes you need to spend money on a motel. Luckily, they're pretty affordable, like $40 to $60 a night for a lot of the rooms is pretty common. But so you definitely need enough money for that. And with a 3-month hike like mine was, I felt comfortable with $5,000, and I ended up not spending it all. So it's definitely doable. It's probably doable for less if you really are frugal about it. But I prefer to have a little bit more. I like to make a hike more enjoyable by being able to indulge myself a little bit. So I prefer to have a little bit of extra spending money to live a little bit more luxuriously, get a motel more often than I would need to, get like a restaurant meal more often than I would need to, just to make the hike that much more enjoyable. It can go a long way.
Luke, what's the biggest takeaway of this adventure for you?
I was kind of guilty of not completely kind of falling into the stereotype about a lot of what we call flyover states, but it turns out they're really not flyover states at all. If you get off the interstates, there's really a lot of cool stuff to see out there. And even going into this hike, as I was planning it, I still didn't know how much cool stuff I'd end up seeing until I actually got out there and experienced it. Hiking a trail or just hiking the country on foot, I think, is the best way to see the U.S. There's plenty of stuff to see here. People often go overseas to get a good adventure, but there's plenty to see right here in the middle of the United States. And really hiking this trail gave me the opportunity that I really wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I'm really grateful that I chose this kind of obscure trip versus an already established trail. I definitely feel like I got a unique experience. And now hopefully that somebody has done it, it might inspire or encourage other people to give it a try. And maybe people will start seeing the value of this area. And then they'll want to protect it and hopefully get involved and help our trail become a reality. That's kind of what I hope down the road.
What's one piece of advice you would give somebody that might want to follow in your footsteps?
Definitely plan. Planning is critical on this hike. There's no guidebook yet anyway. There is a map finally. They kind of took my initial KML file and I sent it to them and they kind of expanded it. So it's on the website now. So there is something available as a baseline for anybody that wants to attempt it. But definitely planning. Definitely if you're interested in tackling even a big portion of it, definitely talk to either myself or the board of directors for guidance, because there's a lot of disclaimers with this hike. It's not like the AT where there's a culture built into it. There isn't even that much established trail. I actually did the math about a year ago when I first started, speaking about this journey, and only about 18% of it is currently established right now as official off-road trail, which is just over 400 miles. So the rest of it is on roadwalks at this time. So you got to be really careful about where you camp. You got to know where all those are. You got to know where your resupplies are. So it takes quite a bit of planning. So definitely reach out to people who are involved with the trail for guidance before you attempt anything. That's definitely the biggest piece of advice that I could do. But also one thing just in general about the trail system as a whole is I advise people to get off of the Triple Crown, go out of your comfort zone a little bit. Try these other trails that are more obscure. Go for a hike on the North Country Trail. Don't let the roadwalks discourage you. Roadwalks actually provide unique opportunities that the trail just doesn't. So definitely, because a lot of these trails are still, there's a lot of gaps in them. Each trail is its own thing. You can't really compare one to the other. You got to kind of go into each journey with a clean slate and kind of take it for what it is, but obviously know what you're getting yourself into also. So kind of study up on the kind of environment you'll be going through, study up on, what the hunting rules are. So when you should be aware of hunting seasons, be aware of the kind of wildlife you might encounter, do all that kind of background research as well. That's definitely important. So planning is the big asterisk with this hike.
If people want to donate to support the trail, how would they do so?
There actually is a tab on the website. I believe it's under the Contact Us page. There's a little page that describes if you want to contact how to do that. I'm not remembering exactly where it is. It's somewhere on the site. There's a tab that says donate. Yeah, so you just go there, and I believe a check is fine. I think that's the most common way people donate, sending a check.
That's at greatplainstrail.org.
Yes.
So, hey, I saw a lot of presentations over the weekend at the expo, and was it you that mentioned that you were thinking about writing a book?
Yeah, so I actually just wrote one that came out last year about the North Country Trail.
Oh, okay.
So my plan is, if the CDC Route thing becomes a reality, is I want to document that journey. So my plan right now is a 4-volume set. So right now I'm working on volume 2, which is the Great Plains Trail hike. I'm further behind on it than I would like to be. I should have had the first draft done about a year ago if I would have gone on the timeline that my NCT book was on. Unfortunately, I'm not quite there yet. I'm about 75% of the way done with the first draft. Someday there will be a book out about it, and I don't know. I have no idea about a title yet. But yeah, my original plan, or my eventual plan, is to have a 4-volume set that documents the 4 pieces of the CDC route.
So how can people find your NCT book?
It's called Thru and Back Again, and the thru is spelled THRU, like the hiker term, and it's available on Amazon currently, and it's $12. There's also an ebook version available as well.
Luke, what is next for you?
Hopefully another hike at some point. I am planning. I have to get permission, obviously, because it'll be during peak season, but I want to hike the Pacific Northwest Trail next year, finally. So right now I'm hoping for a June to basically through August through hike of the PNT, but starting in North Dakota to cover that gap across North Dakota, Montana. So about a 2,000-mile hike starting in probably early June. And then by the time I get to the Rocky Mountains, the snow should be melted by then on a typical year. So that's my plan.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more?
Easiest way is to send me an email. That's just my trail name, Strider, and then the letters NCT, and that's at gmail.com. I also have a guest book on my website if they want to just leave a comment, and I can actually respond directly to their email from there, whatever one they provide in their comment. And also, I do have a Facebook page. You can feel free to send me a message on there, and that's just the same thing. It's Strider NCT, and it's a public figure page. That's where all my journals are posted. They're posts from 3 years ago. They're still up there. All my photos are there in albums organized by state. So if you want to check out some of the amazing scenery that I found, that's the place to go for sure.
And Strider is spelled Strider.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, Luke Jordan, thank you so much again for coming back on the show. I really appreciate it. And hey, congratulations on your thru hike of this, the inaugural thru hike. And good luck on all your upcoming hikes.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, it was great. I had a great time out there on the trail. Now I just enjoy, sharing my experience and hopefully get people excited and get them involved. That's really my end goal here.
Thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, here are a few simple ways. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you listen to the podcast. You can like the show on Facebook or follow along on Twitter @The Pursuit Zone. You can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or Spotify. This episode was recorded on May 8, 2018. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.